Well, first of all, thank you to Gary. Thank you for everyone here at the WFA for inviting me back. It's always a great pleasure to come and talk to this organisation. And I'm excited to be, I'm going to try to talk a bit about 1913. We've been a very unruly lot of speakers and haven't stuck closely to Gary's instructions. There will be some 1913, but like everyone else, I may stray also in different directions. As soon as I thought of talking about 1913, I thought this is for Italy an interwar moment. When we think of interwar, usually we think of the period of the 20s and 30s, but actually for Italy, the period from 1912 to 1915 is an interwar moment because Italy has fought, unlike most of the other countries we've discussed today, Italy's just come out of a war when the First World War begins. Italy has just come out of the Italo-Turkish War of 1911 to 1912, a war against the Ottoman Empire for the control of Libya. And although this is very often considered outside of Italy as a sort of minor and unimportant affair, that's very much not the case. So when we come to the immediate pre-First World War period, one of the first things we need to consider is that Italy is learning lessons from a war that it has or potentially learning lessons from a war that it has itself just fought, and dealing with the aftermath of that war. Italy is also a little different from the other countries that we've discussed here today so far in another respect, which is, of course, that it doesn't enter the war in August 1914, but in May 1915. And as Holger has already mentioned this morning, that means that there's this period of time in which reports about the progress of the war are being sent to Italy, and in which the Italian General Staff has the opportunity to assess what's going on and to potentially try to draw conclusions and learn lessons before joining in the conflict themselves. So the question of Italian military planning in this period does look quite different than that of some of its counterparts. There's one third important difference. Not only has it recently fought an important war of its own, not only does it join the war later, but it also fights a completely different war from the one it expects to fight, because it fights against its former allies and alongside the people it had planned to have as its enemies. So there's an enormous transition that takes place from Italy as a member of the Triple Alliance alongside Germany and Austro-Hungary to Italy fighting against what becomes the Central Powers. And this is a change of alliance that we often hear about from a political perspective. What were the foreign policy reasons behind this change? What were the political consequences? But today I'd like to talk about that a little bit from the military perspective. What does it mean to throw all of your war plans in the bin 9 months before you join a major conflict and have to start over, practically? So, I want to start with a few considerations on pre-war foreign policy and strategy, starting with why does Italy join the Triple Alliance in the first place? Italy is only unified in 1861. It's a great power, but it's often been called the least of the great powers. One of the main priorities within Europe is security. Where do you go for security? Germany is seen as the obvious option. So the Triple Alliance, from the Italian perspective, is first and foremost an alliance with Germany. That's the desirable part. The uncomfortable part that comes with that is that means also allying with Austria-Hungary. Now, that's a much less desirable option from the Italian perspective. And the reason why that's not desirable is that the number one Italian foreign policy goal in the first 50 years of its existence is completing, as they consider it, national unification. So this area up here, which is pale yellow on this map, and these areas here, this is part of Austria-Hungary, where there is a reasonably large Italian-speaking population, and which Italian nationalists consider ought to be incorporated into Italy. So irredentism, the desire to incorporate those territories, is probably the single most important foreign policy goal within mainland Europe that the Italians have. How do you achieve that foreign policy goal when you are allied to the country that rules those territories is a tricky conundrum. But nonetheless, the Triple Alliance is still worth it from the Italian perspective as the best guarantee of security. So the Italians joined the Triple Alliance in 1882, and it is renewed repeatedly. The latest time before the First World War is in 1912. And this is not just a sort of theoretical process, it involves a great deal of collective military planning, as we'll discuss in just a moment. So there are very important consequences for the Italian military of this long-term membership in the Triple Alliance. The other important foreign policy goal is imperial expansion. If you're a great power in the late 19th, early 20th century, you ought to have an empire. And that, of course, is going to be the other core objective. This is the question of completing the unredeemed territories, as they call them up there in the north. There's even the idea of including bits of what will eventually be Yugoslavia, and maybe even some French-speaking territories. Nice, for example, the border city of Nice, which was the birthplace of Garibaldi, was another potential objective. But along with this is the idea of imperial expansion. And it actually is going to be imperial expansion rather than irredentism, rather than expanding the nation, which offers the first opportunity, really, for Italian military action, which comes about in 1911. So these two goals, imperial expansion and irredentism, are either ors, but also complementary, because each is seen as a way to strengthen the nation, to become more of a great power, and the more you go down one path towards great power status, the better you will be positioned, it is thought, with reference to the other. The Italian interest in North Africa has a lot of roots. Partly this is to do with rivalry with France. Partly this is to do with the idea that Italy should be the preeminent Mediterranean power. Its location in the centre of the Mediterranean should give it this status. There's also an idea that maybe somehow Italy can in this way revive the glories of imperial Rome, right? That what is the new Italy? Is it the true heir and inheritor of the glories of the ancient past? What does that mean in practice? It would mean having an empire. And of course, the North African provinces had been such an important part of the classical empire. The first place that actually they would have liked would have been Tunisia, because there's a very, very large Italian population in Tunisia. But Tunisia is off limits because the French have got there first, and so their attention turns to Libya, or what we now call Libya. It's not really recognisable at the time under that name, which is under the occupation of the Ottoman Empire. So that's the kind of backstory to the Italo-Turkish War, which begins in September 1911. And the Italo-Turkish War has been described by some Italian historians as a media war, in the sense that it was almost brought into being by an extremely enthusiastic media campaign. If you read from the end of 1910 onwards, the Italian press, the dailies, the weeklies, the illustrated high-end monthlies, there's this increasing clamour for Italian rights, as they call it, in Libya, the desire to complete what they call the fourth shore of Italy. So we have the Adriatic, the Ionian, and the Tyrrhenian shores. This will be the fourth shore to complete Italian control of the Mediterranean. And it's a war which is greeted with a real degree of public enthusiasm. It's a moment that across the middle and upper classes of Italy generates a great deal of consensus and support. And some of that war enthusiasm, I think, shows up nicely in this board game, which was produced early in 1914. This is a board game where you play to conquer Libya. You move around as you throw the dice. You can see the little numbered circles. You go around through various different commanders. You conquer Tripolitania, which is this part here, and Cyrenaica, which is this part here. And then you go off and you conquer the eastern Mediterranean islands, the Aegean islands of Rhodes, and the other islands here, which Italy is going to seize. And eventually you defeat Turkey. So the idea of this board game, which was a very popular seller, is just this nice representation, I think, of how much at a popular level this is really a war that the Italian people get behind. This is something that is greeted with a lot of enthusiasm. It's also a war that begins in the 50th anniversary of unification. It's almost started for symbolic reasons, in the extent that 1911, we've been a country for 50 years, now it's the time to embark on this great war to prove our great power status. How does it go? Not brilliantly. The initial or the pre-war expectations had been very optimistic that this was going to require minimal effort, a short, glorious campaign, sort of Risorgimento style, lots of flags and trumpets, and the Turk would quickly surrender and go back to his rightful place, and Italy would be proved to be this glorious European great power. They significantly underestimate the resistance of the enemy. The initial expeditionary force turns out to be inadequate, and further reinforcements have to be dispatched in a slightly embarrassing way. The Italians initially believed, on almost no evidence really, that the Arab population would support their invasion, and that the Arabs of North Africa would rather be ruled by Italy than ruled by Turkey. When this doesn't turn out to be the case, they consider that this is betrayal and treason, and that the ungrateful native population has turned on them in this uncalculable fashion. So there are a number of problems with the war effort. It is only resolved really when two things happen. Firstly, problems in the Balkans begin to attract the attention of the Ottomans, and actually the Ottomans do not want to be fighting in Libya and in the Balkans at the same time. And then secondly, the expansion of operations, including naval bombardments into the Eastern Med. So the Italian Navy actually bombards the coast around Syria, Lebanon area. They occupy roads, they land on some of these islands, and by pushing the war more into the Ottomans' backyard, that finally convinces the Ottoman Empire to negotiate. So this is not the kind of glorious, triumphant war experience that many of the war enthusiasts of 1911 had hoped for. What does it mean in terms of military experience and lessons learned? This is the thing which I find really very interesting. Firstly, there's a debate. What kind of lessons might we learn from this? Is this a war between two great powers, Italy and the Ottoman Empire, or is this a colonial war, a small war, not something that has relevance for the wider world? Can we kind of safely bracket this off as something that isn't going to teach any valuable lessons? The Italian military is in a slight double bind here, because if you want to big up your triumph as beating another great power, then this is a European war between two European powers. But if you want to explain the fact that it was sort of rather messy and slow and not quite as triumphant as you want, then maybe you want it to be a colonial war that doesn't have any wider significance. So there's a tendency to try and define it in both ways. It has this kind of hybrid character. One of the things that I think is very interesting is that there are a lot of technical and technological innovations in this war, some of which have already been seen in the Russo-Japanese War, in other conflicts. But exactly, I think, as Holger was saying before the war, the impact that new technologies were going to have were very, very clear. We see, for example, the use of radio. Guglielmo Marconi, the inventor of the radio, is actually present in Libya himself, overseeing the use of radio communications. The use of all kinds of what we think of as newish technologies in the era of the First World War: armoured cars, the systematic use of motorised transport, the widespread use of hand grenades, and of course, above all, for the Italians, the military use of aircraft, not only for aerial reconnaissance, but also the first ever bombing missions, which are carried out on the oases in the Fezzan. And here, this is a commemorative postcard of the volunteer aviators in Cyrenaica. The postcards, I think, are very interesting because they show, again, this sort of media aspect that people at home were really excited about. This sign of the new Italy that had military aircraft and that was clearly this growing power, right? Another important development, or potentially important development, is the first wide-scale use for the Italians of colonial troops. So the Italians have been recruiting Askari, East African soldiers, mostly Eritrean soldiers, since the 1880s, and they deploy them in very large numbers in Libya. They fight very successfully, and this is a sign for the Italians that Italy is going to be on the level with the British and French empires, where colonial troops are a real asset and an important weight in the balance of kind of overall manpower. So there's a lot of signs of modernization in a way, but also growth into kind of great power status, which is the Italian concern in this period. On the other hand, does this mean that, valuable tactical or operational lessons are being learned? Unfortunately, from the Italian point of view, no. In order to learn lessons from the things that went wrong, and there were plenty of them, this would have required the Italian army to actually analyze experience critically, draw some conclusions, and then try to implement some improvements. Instead, the simple fact of victory is read as vindication of business as usual. One analyst writing in a military journal in 1914 said, "We can read the war in Libya as proof of the comforting proof of the success brought by all our patient and careful work." So no real need to try to learn lessons. We've got it sorted. But in fact, what the Italo-Turkish War has revealed is huge problems. Bad maps, sloppy intelligence rooted in a lot of outdated and unquestioned assumptions, as we saw with the assumptions that they made about the Arab population, a really incredibly slow process of mobilization, very poor civil-military cooperation. The Italian government decided on the war in mid-September, which is the harvest season. They didn't notify the military straight away that they were about to call up large numbers of people who were engaged in the harvest. And they announced kind of at the last minute, something which in fact the government had been planning for some time. There's a shortage of NCOs, there's poor training for many of the conscript infantrymen, especially when it comes to shooting. We can also see in action real communication problems in terms of up and down the chain of command, with a relatively top-heavy command system. So a lot of problems emerge very clearly in the 12 months of the Italo-Turkish War. Had the army been able to identify them, critically analyze them, and try to learn lessons, this could have been an incredibly useful experience. Instead, in the words of probably the two most senior military historians of this process, Filippo Capellano and Basilio Di Martino, the Italo-Turkish War left, I quote, "almost no trace in the Italian army regulations." So this is a victory to celebrate. It's not an experience to try and learn from. On top of this complacency, it causes, as I said already, serious shortage in NCOs, but it also uses up most of the Italian munitions stockpile for rifles and artillery. So far from a useful learning experience, this actually leaves the Italian army much worse off in terms of military preparedness, without any compensatory advantage in potentially trying out and learning from these new technological developments. So what is the Italian army doing in this period in terms of planning, if it's not learning lessons from its own war effort? It's focused on its role in the Triple Alliance. The Italian army in this period has two functions. It has the function of its European role, which is going to be strictly envisaged within the Triple Alliance, and its colonial role. In the colonial theatre, they imagine that they may continue to go on the offensive, but within the Triple Alliance, in this period, planning is almost entirely defensive. The Triple Alliance is very clear. It's a defensive alliance in which the contracting parties should prepare for war with France. France is the number one enemy, and whatever other members of the Triple Alliance may have been up to, as we've heard, the Italians are not imagining embarking on an offensive war against France. They're imagining preparing strictly for defensive duties within Europe. So, this is a nice German cartoon of the Triple Alliance, where we have the idea of the kind of relative power ratios, if you like, of the Germans, or the sort of Prussian stereotype, the Austrians, and then Italy, which is childishly tempted by friendship with France in 1908, but also which just gives us a very clear sense of how much weight each of the three members is being perceived as giving to the alliance. And Italy is being kind of rather dragged along by the hand. Although this is a German cartoon, I feel many Italians would have recognized this as a way of perceiving the alliance, because Italy draws directly on German models, and specifically Prussian models, in order to ready itself for its future commitments. The Italian General Staff, for example, when it's created, is created entirely on the Prussian model. Italian military academies are very closely modeled on the Prussian example. The Prussian army in particular is held up as the gold standard of what an army should be, to an almost constricting degree, I think, in Italy, such that things which deviate from the Prussian model are considered as innately inferior. So, what is this planning that they're doing? The plans developed from the late 19th and through the early 20th century envisage this war between France and the Triple Alliance on the Rhine, and most debates focus on how many divisions can Italy send to support the Central Powers on the Rhine. The most comprehensive project, I think, is that drawn up in 1905, which predicts sending 5 army corps and 2 divisions of cavalry, so an expeditionary force of more than 200,000 men and more than 50,000 horses, to be sent in support of a German-Austrian offensive or German-Austrian action on the Rhine. And a lot of the Italian work, actually, in this period is focused on the practicalities of getting them there. So they draw up very detailed transportation plans using the Austrian rail network. How are we going to ship those men and horses to the front? To be honest, it seems doubtful that they could have actually got them there in time to make a significant impact. But that's a lot of what the focus is. A further 2 full armies would be stationed along the Franco-Italian border, where they are intended to basically engage the French in small-scale operations, pin down some French troops, relieve some pressure on the main theatre. But the Italo-French border is not considered as a serious theatre for operations. They do consider the possibility of a direct Italian attack over the Alps into France. The Germans advise them this would be very difficult. I think 1940 shows that they were right, and those plans are discarded. They also briefly even debate an amphibious assault into Provence. Again, this plan is briefly considered and discarded. Basically, 2 armies are going to sit along the French border and try to sort of keep a few French troops busy, and the main Italian responsibility is going to be a supporting effort for the Rhine. This is what the bulk of their mobilization plan is focused on, the bulk of the strategic plan is focused on. Even at the level of training, the idea of what are we preparing our army for is focused on this idea of a defensive war for planners. So, does this mean there is no plan at all for war against Austria-Hungary? No. But planning for war against Austria-Hungary is tricky because they're your ally. It's also worth noticing that planning, the way that the civil military relations operate there, is that planning is concentrated almost entirely in the hands of the Chief of General Staff. Communications between the civil and the military side are very poor, and it means that the Chief of General Staff has perhaps an outsized role compared to some other European militaries. Even the Minister of War has much less say in what's going on. So the Chief of General Staff has this particularly important position. Who is he in this period? He's this man, Alberto Pollio, born in 1852. He had a career first as an artillery officer, then moving into the staff. He was a very keen military historian. He wrote a classic study of Waterloo, a number of other works on the Napoleonic campaigns. And I think this matters because his conception of warfare is explicitly a Napoleonic one. And he is an extremely committed triplicist. He is a Prussophile. He has a deep admiration of the Prussian army. He has an Austrian wife. And he has close personal friendships with his German and Austro-Hungarian counterparts. Here we can see his back with his colleagues von Moltke and Konrad von Hötzendorf and the Kaiser. This is in the German 1913 manoeuvres, I believe. Even Konrad, who notoriously hated Italians, was able to be friends with Pollio. So Pollio, as Chief of General Staff, with this very strongly pro-Triple Alliance outlook, is responsible almost without any oversight, I mean almost no civilian oversight, for drawing up Italy's pre-war plans. He is convinced that war with France is far and away the most likely contingency, and he's also increasingly convinced in the years after the Italo-Turkish War that a war between the two European alliance blocs is very likely. He sees this as a growing probability, I think, in those pre-war years. Not everyone agrees with him, both about the probability of war and above all about the desirability of the Triple Alliance, the desirability of going hand in hand with Austria when, in foreign policy terms, Austria is the enemy, when what Italy most wants to achieve is supposed to be at Austria's expense. There are also some who fear a kind of unprovoked or unpredicted attack from Austria-Hungary. The military attaché in Vienna, for example, observes with some concern that there are almost as many Habsburg forces stationed along the peacetime border between Austria and Italy as there are along the border with Russia. Well, Russia is supposed to be the enemy, Italy is supposed to be a friend. Why are there so many Habsburg forces stationed along that border? Why are the Habsburgs building so many fortresses along that border? So defensive plans for a potential war against Austria are drawn up. And I do emphasize defensive. The voices that Pollio are willing to listen to a degree, are saying we should be prepared to defend ourselves, but Pollio doesn't really have his heart in it. He never really, I think, wants to imagine a war between Italy and Austria-Hungary, and he certainly doesn't countenance the possibility of an aggressive war on Italy's part, which of course is what's going to eventually happen in 1915. Now, planning for war against an ally is tricky. Joint war games, shared planning, the Central Powers have a very good idea of the strengths and weaknesses of the Italian army and of their strategic thought. And both sides, of course, are spying on each other intensively. One example of this is the railway plans that I mentioned, right? If you have detailed plans for how to send your troops along your allies' railway network, it's quite easy for your ally to reverse engineer that and imagine how to send their troops along that network into your country rather than reverse. So the Italians are planning to mobilize their forces. The blue is the Italian railway network and the red is the Austrian, and how to ship them up through Austria towards Germany and send them round to the Rhine. But all of this shared planning gives the Austrians the possibility to think, well, how would we do this process in reverse, right? Shared planning makes you pretty vulnerable. So the Italian army in 1912-13, going into 1914, begins this major revision of mobilization plans in case of this defensive war. The so-called Scacchiere Orientale, the Eastern Zone, becomes increasingly important in the sort of 10 years or so. Really post-1908, we see increasing attention to this zone, more and more planning of how to organize the defense of this area against Austria. One thing that happens, of course, in 1908 is the Austrian takeover of Bosnia, and there's this idea that Austria is going to interfere more and more in the Balkans, and the Balkans are an area that Italy would like to see as its backyard, so there's this sense of a potentially heightened threat from Austria as a result. But even though this kind of defensive process is being increased in a number of ways, we also see a program of fortress building, for example, along the border in the first decade of the 20th century, with 44 new defensive works, in fact, built by 1914. It's rather limited. It's rather limited because the more you increase your defensive strength against Austria, the more likely you are to antagonize them, and it's rather limited because Pollio, as the man in charge, doesn't have his heart in it. And these fortresses Incidentally, a lot of them are finished in haste in 1914, early 1915, and are actually built quite badly. They often look very impressive and then don't actually turn out to do their job all that well. So trying to juggle this tricky balance of potentially planning for war against an enemy without the very existence of those plans antagonizing, against an ally, sorry, without the very existence of those plans antagonizing the ally, create real difficulties. And one thing I think is a very interesting sign of that, when the Italians are planning how to disrupt the Austrian rail network and potential Austrian mobilization against them, they use commercially available tourist postcards. These postcards are from the army archive. The Italian General Staff is using postcards and a kind of publicly available commercial information of this kind to try to unobtrusively imagine what it might be doing to disrupt the rail network. This just seems like this hesitant, slightly difficult situation that they're caught in. As war between the two alliance blocs seemed, in Pollio's view, increasingly likely, he repeatedly reiterates his intention of fulfilling his Triple Alliance obligations. But the effect of the Italo-Turkish War starts to make itself felt. And because of the shortages caused by that conflict, in 1914, Pollio amends the 1905 plan. He says, actually, I think we can only send 3 army corps instead of 5 to the Rhine. But he's still committed absolutely to that. The other thing that Pollio is interested in doing is in updating the Italian doctrine. Not really because of the war in Turkey, but because there has been a debate going on in Italy, just as there has in other countries, between how to interpret the lessons of the Boer War and the Russo-Japanese War. So the Italians had released a new doctrine in 1903, essentially influenced by the Boer War, focusing on the impact of new weapons. They've released a second new doctrine in 1910, which is supposed to be learning the lessons of the Russo-Japanese War, which is focused on the impact of concerted mass infantry attacks. The 1913 doctrine is an attempt to take the best of both worlds, right? So the 1913, Pollio publishes this new version of the central doctrine of the Italian army, the Norme per combattimento, rules for combat, along with a new operational schema for the deployment of major units. And the new norme basically ignore the experiences of the Libyan war. Their concept for operations is extremely offensive-centered. It emphasizes the likely dominance of massed central fronts, but it also emphasizes the kind of new impact of fire. And it very much follows what Pollio himself calls Napoleonic principles. And here we see his own interest in the Napoleonic era coming through. And what he means by Napoleonic principles is unity of command, concentration of forces at the decisive location, and the ability to correctly recognize the decisive moment for maneuver. And he's still very much thinking in terms of large-scale maneuver. I think it's fair to say that Pollio himself and the doctrine that he propounds are not dogmatic. It is a reasonably flexible doctrine. It's pragmatic, it's task-focused. Apart from anything else, Pollio himself has to be reasonably flexible because he doesn't really know what the civilian government is up to. He doesn't know what the civilian government is planning. So they might suddenly drop him in it at any moment, right? So he has to be able to be reasonably flexible and reasonably adaptable. The 1913 new doctrine, though, has only just really started to filter down through into reorganizing training, what this might mean down to the company level when we move into 1914. So these are still really thought of as a new set of rules. And they do emphasize the spirit of the offensive. They do emphasize the role of hand-to-hand fighting, a kind of cult of the infantry, and so on. So this brings us up to 1914. When Franz Ferdinand is assassinated in June 1914, Italian public attention is actually elsewhere. Italy has just had an attempted left-wing revolution. There's something called Red Week in the first part of June 1914, in which in central Italy and Romagna and basically all of the region that is currently underwater, an enormous attempted insurrection had been launched. The army had been called out to suppress it quite brutally, and basically most Italians are more focused on that than the assassination when it comes along. It's front page news, but after a couple of days, the Italians go back to worrying about domestic affairs. Then, to further complicate things, on July the 1st, Pollio drops dead of a heart attack. This is really terrible timing, right? To lose your chief of general staff right at this critical juncture throws the Italian military into this terrible moment of kind of leaderlessness. There's no time to spend too much dilly-dallying about the choice of a replacement. And that's where this man comes in, Luigi Cadorna. So Cadorna is, he's nearly 64 at this point. He is in some ways a surprising choice. In fact, he himself is a bit surprised. He said, I thought my military career was basically over. He's had a lifetime career in the general staff. He's written a lot of infantry manuals. He's very interested in infantry tactics and in infantry artillery cooperation. He's been involved in a number of planning exercises at a fairly senior level and wargaming within the Triple Alliance. But he's a surprise because he was already considered for the top job in 1908 when Pollio had been appointed and rejected. And the reason that he'd been rejected was that he refused stubbornly to accept the requirement of working under civilian control in wartime, a problem that would rapidly recur in the First World War. And the really big problem about him is that he has never held any operational command. He hasn't been involved in any of the colonial wars. His career has been purely staff work and this kind of writing of doctrinal manuals. As soon as he's appointed, in the final week of July, he begins to plan to fulfill his Triple Alliance obligations. War is looming. Italy needs to send these army corps to the Rhine, right? He says, okay, Pollio had revised our original 5 down to 3, but actually, now that war is really here, we should revise that back up to 5. On July 31st, he presents his plans to first the foreign minister, then the king, to send the full 5 army corps, as envisaged, to the Rhine, and 2 armies ready to deploy on the French border. Nobody's told him that actually the Italian government has decided to announce its neutrality. Once neutrality has been declared, Cadorna is one of the people who immediately says, Italy cannot stay out of this war. If we're not going to fulfill our Triple Alliance obligations, we actually need to be prepared for war on the other side. And he immediately embarks on the very difficult process of building up and equipping the armies to make good, first of all, on the deficits of the Libyan war, and then secondly, to prepare them for a major conflict. Now, Cadorna is a much criticised man, but I think that one of his undoubted achievements is this period of preparation for warfare. In August 1914, when he takes over, there are 300,000 men ready in the Italian army, but to be honest, only about 100,000 of them are ready to be put in the field. By the time Italy joins the war in May the following year, there's over 900,000 men ready to deploy, and by August of the following year, it'll be 1.5 million. These men have been trained, equipped, organised, given new officers and NCOs. This is an enormous achievement, and I think the credit for this definitely should go to Cadorna. And I make this point because he has often been criticised for every aspect of his command, which is perhaps excessive. But the other thing that he has to do is plan an offensive campaign against Austria, and there is no offensive campaign against Austria that has ever really been planned before. So I'm not going to talk today about his strategy, which has been much critiqued, but I do think that from a standing start to create an entire new offensive strategy would not be an easy task even for the greatest strategist after 30 years of alliance with Austria. The other thing he does is he sets about revising the 1913 Norme, Pollio's big doctrinal document, and he's doing this in light of the news that is coming in from the ongoing war. So he has this period, August through to May, in which he can collect all of this information. He has his network of military attaches, he has observers out in the field, he has people obviously scouring the newspapers and so on. 6 new tactical regulations are issued by him in that time. And in them we can see how the Italian army is changing its thinking based on what's going on elsewhere. So a new set of tactical regulations is issued at the very end of August, and it reflects attacking speed and movement. It presents defensive entrenchments as temporary expedients. It emphasises the war of mobility. It reflects, in short, what is going on in Belgium in August of 1914, right? It doesn't say anything at all about how to coordinate infantry and artillery. It doesn't say anything at all about the machine gun. He imagines that this war of movement is going to continue. Obviously, the Battle of the Marne changes his calculations quite significantly, and we start to move towards new tactical doctrines. One big problem, though, if we consider all of the reports that are coming in from the military attaches, some of which we heard about already this morning, is how to figure out which of these lessons would be most useful for a war that might be fought in the high mountains and along the rocky highlands of the Italo-Austrian front. Is the Western Front the best guide? Maybe the more mobile warfare of the Eastern Front is a more useful guide. We sometimes criticise Cadorna for not learning the lessons of the Western Front, and it certainly seems that he doesn't. But why would he assume that the Western Front was the only set of lessons to be learned, right? It's not clear to him which of these sources should be relied on. And Luigi Giovanni, the attaché in Berlin, sent back these incredibly detailed reports about the terrible situation on the Western Front, but he's actually given an official reproof from the staff command in Italy for his excessively pro-German position. His extreme admiration for the German army is considered to have biased him and to be undermining his objectivity. So some of the reports which are coming in are also being ignored or kind of downgraded. Cadorna's most important tactical manual is published in February 1915. It's his so-called Little Red Book, Attacco frontale ammaestramento tattico, so frontal attack and tactical instructions. And it does draw in part on information that's coming in from the Western Front. He probably listens more to the attaché who's been with the French rather than who's been with the Germans. He emphasises, again, frontal attack, the need for offensive spirit, but there is a significant change compared to the 1913 norme. He says this is going to be much more difficult than anticipated. The solution that he proposes is that the attacking infantry will need to be slower, more methodical, attack in waves in these very standardized units. Some of these things may sound familiar. There's no provision for flexibility and specialization. There's basically the idea that given the new strength of firepower and the defensive, a sort of steady, almost mechanistic advance is going to be the most useful tactic. There have been extensive critiques of this tactical manual that I don't need to go into now, but I think that this doesn't necessarily reflect an unwillingness to change. It's not that he's refusing to learn lessons so much as, well, I would say two things. Firstly, in February 1915, when the Little Red Book is coming out, I don't think any army has solved the problem of what to be doing on the battlefield. So if we say Cadorna's ideas are wildly off, he's not the only one. Clearly, he's ignoring some of what's going on. By February, March 1915, Jonathan Krause has argued that the French are beginning to move towards early iterations of infiltration tactics, right? Cadorna is completely ignoring that. But again, the questions of which experiments, which new ideas are going to be the useful ones to learn from are not super clear at that point. The other thing is that Cadorna ultimately isn't in charge of the decision to keep Italy out of the war or to join the war. He doesn't know when they're going to join the war. As far as he knows, just as in 1911, the civilian government suddenly threw the army into war with almost no notice, the same may happen again. He may be dumped into a winter war overnight by the civilian government. In fact, when the civilian government finally do sign the treaty in April 1915, they don't inform him until afterwards, until several, I think it's nearly a week afterwards, that a date for the Italian entry to the war has been set. So there's an element of scramble to what Cadorna's doing. You never quite know when this war might finally come along. So, in theory, Italy should have had a huge advantage from its late entrance to the war. This 9 months of neutrality should have been a perfect opportunity to learn lessons. In practice, that's not necessarily the case. But I think that a really important part of why that isn't the case, as well as the damaging effects of the war that they fought 2 years earlier against Turkey, is the enormous difficulty of switching alliance, the enormous difficulty of scrapping 30 years of planning, but also 30 years of mental outlook, of imagining yourself as a pro-Prussian, as a Prussophile military, and suddenly turning around to see Prussia and, above all, Austria as the enemy. And the strategic planning difficulty and the kind of psychological difficulty of switching alliance means that when Italy does enter the war, far from having an advantage, it does so really in far from ideal conditions. Thank you.